Okay, you can feel free to open up the chat room and ask questions as we go along. All right, let's begin with the study of blood, known as hematology. We let's see. We look at the blood in terms of its components. All right, blood is the life force. If you look at chapter 13, the heart-lung machine, circulation and respiration, we start with a touching story, the case of his daughter's heart, where as you know from reading the story, the father takes his daughter's heart in a transplant after her accident. And it's a very touching story. It's meant for us to think about transplants and to think about blood transfusions and to think about blood as a life force. And I have some Mayan art in figure 13.1 to kind of show you the Mayan Indian sacrifices and a little history of how blood as a life force has always been fascinating to different cultures. And so, in the checkup section, we talk about organ donation and what laws should be. Our agenda, of course, is to talk about the blood's components, diseases of the blood, look at how blood functions within the body. Okay, so let's start off just with the definition. Hematology is the study of blood. A hematologist studies blood. Basically, the heart, blood vessels, and the blood are all integrated into one unit for us. And let's start on page 469, all right? Taking a look at blood as a life force. If you look on the notes, vessels go from the heart through a bunch of different types of vessels and then back to the heart, all right? After the exam, we'll start with the heart and the blood vessels, okay? And we'll talk about those. Let's first kind of take a look at the three general types of blood vessels. They're arteries, which bring blood away from the heart. That would be over here. They carry what we call oxygenated blood. Oxygenated means has more oxygen than not, okay? Then the arteries break up into what we call a capillary bed, or a bunch of little vessels, and that's where exchange happens. Exchange being diffusion, diffusion of materials, right? Wastes, gases, food. And then finally, from the capillary bed back to the heart, veins bring blood back to the heart. And we say that the blood is deoxygenated in the veins. If you look at my veins, if you look at your own veins, they're a little bit of a bluish color. Part of the reason for that, blood is not blue, by the way. That's always been a myth. The veins give a bluish hue through the skin due to its deoxygenated nature. Deoxygenated doesn't mean no oxygen. It just means a lesser amount of oxygen, a certain percentage less than in the artery, which is oxygenated, all right? Obviously, when any blood hits the air, it turns red instantly because the air has a ton of oxygen, which oxygenates the blood. So to make a long story short, arteries, capillaries, and veins, I want you just to know the difference between them. Arteries bring blood away from the heart, veins bring blood back to the heart, and capillaries are the very small vessels for exchange. Just as an idea to understand where the blood is moving. We will focus more on the vessels later on in the chapter, okay, in a different lecture. So look at the blood's composition. We have about a 55-45 split between 55% plasma, and plasma is a straw-colored liquid. What do we mean by a straw-colored liquid? Well, its coloration is a little bit brownish, light brown, and it's made of 90% water. Plasma is made up of 90% water, has a lot of dissolved solutes in the blood. When you get a blood test, you test for a large number of dissolved solutes. And we'll talk about what those means later on in the lecture today. The formed elements make up 45% roughly of the blood. If I had to be specific, there's a little layer in between the plasma and the formed elements. When you take a centrifuge, this is a centrifuge tube. When you take a centrifuge and you spin it with blood, as you know, in this week's lab, you saw a video on that, it separates out based on weight. And the lighter remains on top, the lighter materials. That's your plasma, about 55%. The heavier stuff, the formed elements, go to the bottom. And let me say, this layer is known as the Buffy layer. You don't really have to know that term, but it has your white blood cells as a layer over there, and then underneath the rest. All of it is together 45% making up the formed elements. So what do we mean by formed elements? Formed elements mean you're forming it. The body is forming it in the red marrow. Platelets, white blood cells, and red blood cells are what are formed. Platelets are your little clotting factors. Everyone take a look at the overhead here. Platelets are your clotting factors. They're very small. They are fragments of cells. And in figure 13.2, look at page 471, figure 13.2, I have the same image and I break up the formed elements and the plasma into its components. It's a little bit nicer of a picture. So I just want to address figure 13.2. You can look at it in your text. Let's go over the formed elements for a minute. Platelets are the clotting factors. White blood cells, also known as leukocytes, okay? See the word leukocyte? They are your defenders. They defend against the enemy. Then we have the red blood cells, also known as your erythrocytes. Erythro means red, and they carry oxygen. And with the red blood cells, we say that there's a hematocrit. The hematocrit gives you the percentage of red blood cells in your blood. 42 plus or minus 5 for women is normal. And if you look here, 47 plus or minus 7 for men. So women have a little bit less than men, due to musculature and, body composition. But I just want you to know that's your hematocrit, percentage of red blood cells. So when someone's anemic, we say that they have a lower percentage of red blood cells. Let's talk about the characteristics of blood. First of all, it's alkaline. That means, and this is very important, the blood pH has to remain between 7.35 and 7.45. All right, I just give a number, 7.4. If it varies too far beyond that, we call it respiratory acidosis or alkalosis. All right, too acidic, too basic. Especially acidosis is something that's often on the nursing boards when the blood pH goes too low. We will discuss that at another point, why. But the blood has to remain a very stringent or narrow pH range. The blood makes up 8% of our body weight, and bright red blood means it has oxygen, and dark red blood means it does not, oxygen poor. Men have 5 to 6 liters or 1.5 gallons of blood, just so you get an idea how much blood is in the body. Women, slightly less, 4 to 5 liters. All right, so what's the function of blood? Most of us know it distributes food, oxygen, and wastes, right? You get rid of carbon dioxide waste in the lungs. You get rid of nitrogen waste in the kidney, all through the blood. Hormones transport around. That was the topic of our last lecture. Hormones transport around using the blood as its system. Food and oxygen have to be brought to every cell of the body. If you don't have oxygen, you die if you're a cell within 4 minutes. Food need continual source of food. Regulation and protection is not often thought about by people about the blood. If you think about it, when you're walking outside, you ever look at your arms? Your blood vessels start bulging a bit. And it can be a little scary if you're really hot. It regulates body temperature. The blood vessels, what we say, vasodilate. They get bigger, and blood flushes the surface of the skin to give off heat. So definitely regulation of body temperature is one characteristic of the blood. pH homeostasis. In the last course, we talked about, in ANP1, the bicarbonate carbonic acid buffering system. We will talk more about that when we do respiration. But that system buffers the pH of the blood. So changes are mitigated. Fluid volume. People often don't think of the fact that your blood maintains or holds water in it, and a certain amount of water. Albumin, protein, salts keep the water balance in your body. All right, so we know that water follows solute. So blood has a certain amount of dissolved particles to maintain that water balance. Last but not least is protection. The blood protects you from the enemy. Antibodies, you've heard a lot about that in the news, right? And I'm kind of excited about the coronavirus treatment with antibodies. I believe it was Regeneron, the company doing it, where they're synthesizing antibodies. Antibodies, as you know, from ANP1, are little proteins that attack the enemy. And what they're doing now is synthesizing, kind of fake proteins that will match and mask the spike protein on the coronavirus, and combining that with plasma from recovered patients, which have a certain amount of antibodies in them. And so, giving people who had the coronavirus immunity. And yes, indeed, it does give you immunity. That was fake news, that you're not going to get immune after you get the coronavirus. Unfortunately, there's a lot of fake news around, and that's the problem. But they cited some studies where people turned positive again. And not to go on a tangent, but, it's your blood that protects you from viruses like corona and other things. So let's talk about protection. White blood cells. We're going to go over the different white blood cells in the blood that protect you. Complement proteins. These are little proteins that blow holes in the enemy. Clotting. You're protected from cuts. You cut yourself, you clot to prevent excess blood loss. All of that falls under protection. So regulation, protection, and distribution are all the three major functions of the blood. So let's start with the plasma and work our way down. Okay, guys, if you look at figure 13.2, page 471, the plasma you can see is 91% water, 2% solutes, and 7% proteins. The proteins, let's start with the water, I guess. Roughly 91% water. That's the blood. Obviously, that's our life force. We're mostly made of water. We also have about 100 dissolved solutes. When you get a blood test, those solutes are what are looked at. Calcium often can show improper regulation due to the parathyroid or even bone cancer. Urea shows kidney functioning. Are you getting rid of that waste? Bilirubin shows definitely liver functioning. Liver processes bilirubin. If it doesn't, and it's in the blood, it means something may be wrong with the liver. So those types of dissolved solutes tell us through a blood test of how your general health is. So getting a complete blood count is a good idea every year to get an idea of your general health. And they do that in adult testing yearly. Plasma proteins maintain your osmotic balance. What am I talking about? The word is albumin. All right. Repeat after me. Folk, soak, croak. What is egg white? If you said yolk, you are incorrect. That's egg yellow. Albumin is egg white. See, that's a little good joke. Did you like my joke? I'm not sure. Terrible. Albumin is egg white, and that is actually in all of your blood, in a tiny form. That maintains osmotic balance, keeps the water in the vessels to maintain that osmotic balance, to maintain the right amount, and it's made by the liver primarily, to maintain the right amount of water in your body. Okay, that is your plasma. I bet you didn't think we'd have that much to say about plasma. All right, and if you look at figure 13.2, it breaks down some of the solutes and the different components of the plasma. Moving along to the formed elements. Basically, if you look at figure 13.2, we've got the different number or amount of white blood cells, platelets, and red blood cells in your formed elements, okay? Now, let's begin by discussing the general idea behind how red blood cells are not really cells, okay? We would say most of your red blood cells, 2/3 of it, are not true cells. Red blood cells will develop over in the bone marrow. And as they develop, they're mostly, they develop without a nucleus. They survive only a few days. They're not mitotic. They don't have a nucleus. So you can almost say that they're not really a true cell. They're biconcave, about the size of a bacteria, 7.5 micrometers in diameter. Little spectrin proteins help their pliability. And I might ask you, why would you have a cell that has no components, no organelles? There are no organelles in a red blood cell. There is simply a lot of what we call hemoglobin, which carries oxygen. The hemoglobin molecule is a quaternary protein, as we talked about, and it has, you know, 2 alpha, 2 beta chains, which are bound together in a ring-like heme group. Okay, the structure of hemoglobin we've gone over when we did organic chemistry way back. And if you remember, there's a ring-like heme group inside, each holding an iron molecule. That heme group carries one hemoglobin carries 1 billion oxygen molecules. Each heme group carries an iron, which carries oxygen. And of course, iron oxide is rust. So that's a good table talk conversation over dinner. Each of our red blood cells is filled with rust. That is how we carry our oxygen. So HB is the abbreviation for hemoglobin. You should get used to that. HB is hemoglobin. It carries oxygen, but most people don't know that it also carries carbon dioxide. 20% of your carbon dioxide is carried on the hemoglobin molecule. And we say, and we'll come back to that when we do respiration. We say that the production of red blood cells is known as hemopoiesis. So the red marrow, often in the epiphyses of long bones, carries out hemopoiesis. And it starts in something called pluripotential stem cells. You don't have to go crazy with that word. It's just, stem cell research is a big area of research. It basically is like embryonic type cells that become anything you want them to be. Pluripotential stem cells become, in the red marrow, blood cells, different types of blood cells. In this case, red blood cells. And the blood needs balance. You increase red blood cells, you actually get thicker or viscous blood. If you decrease it, you don't have enough oxygen, but you get thinner blood. And we say that's hypoxia. When you don't have enough oxygen, that's hypoxia. You can write that next to the word hypoxia, not enough oxygen. Production of red blood cells depends on a few things. And if you don't have these things, you have anemia. Okay, if you don't make enough red blood cells, you have anemia, not enough oxygen carrying capacity. And we'll talk about that later. But step one, you need iron. You don't have enough iron, iron deficiency anemia. You need B12 vitamins, B vitamins. Otherwise, you have pernicious anemia. You need the amino acids, you know, otherwise your nutrition isn't there, or you don't have the hormones, testosterone. You won't make enough red blood cells. There's also a hormone known as EPO, known as erythropoietin, made by the kidneys. Most people don't know the kidney is an endocrine organ. The kidneys make erythropoietin. The kidneys detect how much oxygen you're getting in some of its special kidney cells. And when you don't have enough oxygen, kidney makes EPO, erythropoietin, to get the marrow to produce more red blood cells. A red blood cell does not carry any organelles. Now, why might you think that? You know, I might even open up the chat room. I'll give you like 30 seconds. Think about, why would a red blood cell not carry, why no organelles in a red blood cell? Let's think about that. Whoops, that should be a red blood cell. It keeps becoming an ABC, RBC, I said. This is silly. Okay, there we go, RBC. Anyone have an idea? Why would you not want to carry, I'll give you a hint, a mitochondria, or, you know, organelles in your red blood cell? See, this is our little oral quiz. Someone say something. What the heck? Type it into the chat room. Any answer will be acceptable. You have 15 seconds. There's no nucleus. That is true. There's no nucleus and no organelles. All right, let me give you a hint. Do you want, this is a bad hint, Taylor. Do you want a baker who eats his own bread, who's chubby and loves donuts? Is that a good thing to have? So a person is baking, they're working at Dunkin' Donuts. This guy says no. And they eat all their own inventory. That would be hideous. All right. So the big question is, Tanya says no. All right. The big question is, then why does a red blood cell not have mitochondria or any organelles? That's a kind of a weird thought, but I'll let you think another 10 seconds. I told you it was a bad hint, but you never know. So the big question is, why no organelles in a red blood cell? What would happen if you did have mitochondria in a red blood cell? What does mitochondria use up? Everyone knows mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. What does it use to give you power? It gives you ATP, but what does it use to get the ATP? It's a tough question. All right, let me ask you. Make it multiple choice. A, does it use waste? B, does it use, oh, you got it, oxygen. Excelente, Tanya, that's right. Now, uses oxygen and sky to get ATP. That is your life force. ATP is what keeps you alive. So if you have mitochondria in your red blood cells, what would be used up? I think you said it, Tanya, you just said oxygen. So the oxygen is used up, and it would totally negate the whole purpose of the red blood cell. Like the baker eating all of his donuts. You would never get to sell the donuts, just like the red blood cell will never get to carry the oxygen. And that is why they're just these empty cells carrying a ton of hemoglobin and oxygen. But if you don't have a nucleus and you don't have anything, you ain't going to last long. So they only last 120 days, right? So you guys did a good job with that. See, that's what we would do in class a little more. And it would take a lot of time. I would aggravate you, and you kind of got it. But look at this. That's the point. So in other words, let me give you the take-home message here. The take-home message, guys, is that red blood cells are not true cells because they would eat up and gobble up their own oxygen. They don't have a nucleus. They are just carriers. But as a result, they die pretty quickly. 4 months, that's it. 100 to 120 days, and the red blood cell will be destroyed, reprocessed by the spleen and the liver. Macrophages phagocytize them, and they are reprocessed in the liver, okay? And hemoglobin is regenerated and given out as bilirubin, all right? And that is how we process red blood cells. So I guess my point is, these are just, as you can see, empty cells, biconcave, carrying a lot of oxygen and hemoglobin, and they don't last long because they do not reproduce. They do not regenerate and fix their damaged areas, whereas a normal cell does. So that's why they don't last long, and you keep producing new ones in your marrow. Okay, let's see. Well, moving along, let's move on to the white blood cells. Yeah, 4,800 to 10,800 white blood cells per cubic millimeter of blood. And I want to say that its main function is defense. Viruses like the coronavirus, bacteria like Mr. Pimples, Staphylococcus, and what we often forget, tumor cells. There is some evidence to support that your immune system continues to fight cancer regularly. And that is why you can keep up your immune system, you can fight off cancer. There's direct evidence, and I showed you last semester, I'm going to show you this semester when we do immunology, of a white blood cell gobbling up a cancer cell. So that's a big area of research that I don't want to talk about now. We can talk about when we do immunology, but to what extent does the immune system keep cancer at bay? You know, to what extent is cancer genetic, and to what extent is it due to environment, including you having a good immune system and supporting your immune system properly to fight off the cancer? That is the question. So, okay, let's talk about the white blood cells. I want you to go to page 474, figure 13.4 has a picture of all of the white blood cells. And we group the white blood cells into the granulocytes and the agranulocytes, okay? The granulocytes are those that have little granules. And if you look closely at the picture, basophils, eosinophils, and neutrophils have granules. And the agranulocytes, A means without, like an amoral person has no morals. Agranulocytes have no granulocytes. Lymphocyte, I know I have a few friends like that. I really believe it. Lymphocytes and monocytes, amoral people. Lymphocytes and monocytes are agranulocytes. So never let monkeys eat bananas helps you remember from most to least numerous of the leukocytes, all right? In other words, never, neutrophils, the most numerous, let, lymphocytes, next most numerous, monocytes, next most numerous at 5%, eosinophils, eat, basophils, bananas. All right, neutrophils make up 50 to 70%, lymphocytes about 20%, monocytes 5%, and I don't know, 2% eosinophils, 1% basophils. So most to least. All right, the function is defense. They do it by leaving the capillary bed. They squeeze their little bodies. There's a picture of on page 13, page 475, figure 13.4. You can see a picture of a lymphocyte. They push their little bodies outside of the capillary bed through a process known as diapedesis. Diapedesis is just pushing your little body out. That's what it's called in scientific terms. And so let's start with the neutrophils. I gotta say, the neutrophils are my most excited one. If you take a look, it doesn't look as exciting. A neutrophil is polymorphonucleated. You can see that there's a couple of lobes to the nucleus. Usually there's even more than two. The picture in the book only shows 2 lobes. You can actually see about 3 to 6 lobes usually. And they're bacteria slayers. That is, they are the first line of defense. They're the first to come to an area, and to their function, believe it or not, is what we call a respiratory burst. I have a picture of it. Actually, I have a picture of it, the respiratory burst. Where the heck's my picture of the respiratory burst? It was somewhere. Now I'm here. You know what? It's in the immune chapter. Sorry. It just shows how the neutrophil throws out a lot of bleach and peroxide along with little defensive spears to attack the enemy. And I have to say, Trump was not wrong when he said that bleach does attack the enemy. It's too bad people, people mistook it, but the neutrophil mechanism is the respiratory burst, which shoots bleach and neutrophils out of a white blood cell. That is how the first line of defense works. And it's too bad all the politics carry, they can't. I mean, it was kind of funny. People going wild, everyone going wild with it. But, and I shouldn't joke, but I mean, there is some truth to the fact that the bleach and the peroxide are what actually fight as a first line of defense, the neutrophils. And weirdly, I put it on every exam. I don't think I put it on this exam. Too political. But I always put it on each exam for the last 20 years because it's interesting. They have their own little bleach units. All right, whatever. Moving on, let's talk. So if it ends in "phil," it's filled with granules. That makes it a granulocyte. The eosinophil also has granules. Eosinophils are a weird one. They're like, if you get worms, you got eosinophil increases. Okay, that's a silly way to put it, but I think you'll remember it. What eosinophils do is attack parasites, not bacteria so much, but like ringworm, fungal infections. If you see a spike in eosinophils, in the blood that there's some sort of parasite, malaria. Neutrophils, if you see a spike, that it's some sort of bacterial attack because they are the bacteria slayers. Okay, guys? Basophils are Mr. Raise your hand if you have an allergy. I mean, you don't have to put your thing on, but, if you have an allergy, often it's detected by an increase in basophils. Basophils have big, large granules that are filled with histamines. And you guys know histamines vasodilate and cause, congestion, more fluid in an area. And to make a long story short, basophils will bind to something called antibody or immunoglobulin E. That is your allergy antibody. We'll talk more about that when we do immunology. So those are your three granulocytes. The agranulocytes are a little bit more interesting in a way. The picture on page 475 is a close-up of a lymphocyte. Lymphocytes have all brain and no body. In other words, a large nucleus and very little cell volume. And that's because they are the brains behind the operation. There's two types of lymphocytes, T cells and B cells. And you will learn about that more when we do immunology, but I want to just differentiate them right here and now because it's good for you to think about early on. T cells directly attack the enemy, like cancer, viruses, direct attack, many of them. Not T helpers, but many of the T cells, cytotoxic T cells, etc. Then we've got B cells. They produce. They're just factories that produce antibodies. Okay, and that's what gives you your long-term immunity. Like to the coronavirus, long-term immunity comes from the B cells. So T cells and B cells are both lymphocytes. All right, that's what lymphocytes become, and they are like very powerful. And they are the brains behind the operation. And that's all I can tell you now. They're the general. Think of it that. Think of it as like the general behind the complicated battle strategies. Whereas the neutrophils are more of your frontline defenders, attacking the enemy with bleach. All right. Then we've got monocytes. Monocytes make up about 5%, 3 to 8%. They're big. They're big in size. I think that the picture on figure 13.4 shows the relative size nicely. A little more than double the size of an average granulocyte. They're phagocytic. They're kind of the big tanks that attack and gobble up the enemy. They become wandering. There again, all of them are produced by leukopoiesis, which means white blood cell production. And the figure 13.4 shows leukopoiesis. And a lot of things stimulate the production of white blood cells, interleukins, CSFs, colony stimulating factors. I don't want to get too crazy. This part you don't have to really know too much right now, but I just want you to think about the fact that hormones and chemicals control the production of white blood cells, mainly monocytes. Just in terms of disease, leukemia is a cancer of a white blood cell. That's the definition of it. You can even write that next to it. Cancer of a white blood cell. And a renegade, some sort of renegade leukocyte, if you look at the figure 13.4, at some point along the line in the development of the white blood cell, a renegade, you know what a renegade is, a rebel, someone who's not right, a clone that divides out of control. That is leukemia. When one of the cells becomes cancerous, cancer meaning growing out of control. You know that from ANP1. But then and you might say, I had a cousin who died of leukemia actually in 1979, very sad. And, I said, well, if he's got more white blood cells, isn't that good? It's just a babe, 8 years old, made sense. And the answer is it clogs, I knew it at that age, it clogs up the rest of the good cells. So that's the trouble with cancer. It doesn't function right, but gets in the way and prevents normal functioning. So take-home message, leukemia, cancer of the white blood cells. Some sort of renegade grows out of control. And the name of the cancer is always based on the type of cell that is cancerous. So lymphocytic leukemia means cancer of the lymphocyte. And you got two types of leukemias, acute and chronic. Acute is not cute, okay? Acute means sudden onset, comes quickly advancing, and that's mostly in children and adolescents. One might say it's almost more dangerous than the chronic. Chronic means long-term. It's slowly advancing, can advance for 10 years, In the elderly and slowly weakening immune systems, you have the chronic leukemia, where it's a slow deterioration and a slow buildup of the white blood cells. Infectious mononucleosis, related in a way to leukemia in that it's caused by the viral Epstein-Barr virus, That does not mean if you have mono, you're going to get leukemia. It's just these are related viruses, and it's contagious. I remember looking at foamy cytoplasm. That's what it looks like under the microscope. The kissing disease is not just kissing. Anytime, liquids from the mouth, liquid transfer. It's not airborne like corona. It is mostly, liquid transfer from sharing cups and food and such. And mono, essentially, or what is mono? What is mononucleosis? It is the attack on some white blood cells, and it's characterized by, tiredness, and it can go on for an extended period of time, years, it relapses where this virus acts up. Last but not least, clotting, platelets. So we talked about red blood cells, right? We talked about white blood cells. Now, the third formed element is platelets. Platelets are cell fragments. If you look on figure 13.4, you can see a megakaryocyte breaks up and becomes platelets, little cell fragments. And they don't have any nucleus or organelles, and they're not even as good as red blood cell. They're just tiny, as you can see from the relative size in figure 13.4. They have clotting factors. They're kept inactive by prostaglandins, our friend prostaglandins, and nitric oxide. Hemostasis, that is their main function, halting of bleeding, and it occurs in 3 phases, all right? First, what's hemostasis? You get cut. Here's the picture. You get cut, and what's on the left? A clot. You got a clot. So step 1 of a clot is a vascular spasm. That means you vasoconstrict or make smaller the blood vessel going to that area due to chemicals released by the platelets and endothelial cells lining the red blood cells. Endothelial cells lining the blood vessels. All right, remember we said those cells line blood vessels. So anyway, to make a long story short, step 1 of hemostasis is a vascular spasm, and that involves what? Vasoconstriction. Step 2 is to make a platelet plug formation. This is a picture of the platelet plug formation, right? You remember, positive feedback allows you to clot. What's a platelet plug? The lines are collagen fibers in the picture. Collagen fibers that trap like a net. They trap like a net a bunch of other platelets to form a web and clot the blood. And if you take a look at figure 13.3, we show you the formation of a clot. In this case, it's a clot in a vessel causing a heart attack on the right, and on the left, it's a little image of a clot. And platelet granules are activated when there's a series of different enzymes. And we're going to go over those different enzymes acting. It happens to be that serotonin enhances vascular spasms, ADP attracts more platelets, and what occurs in the final step, right? The platelet plug, in other words, the platelet plug has to become a gel, a clot, and that's known as coagulation. Coagulation is clotting. That's the word for clotting. If you remember anything from this, know the word coagulation means clotting. And there's 2 processes by which we clot, intrinsic and extrinsic. When we clot extrinsically, that means the tissue gets damaged, tissue cells die and release tissue factor, which is a big word, tissue factor, and that initiates, 200 clotting factors. If we go the intrinsic pathway, and what do I mean by go the intrinsic pathway? I mean, if the inside of a vessel initiates the clot, as you can see in figure 13.3 on the right, the inside of the vessel is initiating a clot where platelets stick to the collagen fibers that are damaged in the vessel. PF3 is a chemical that's made by the platelets to start the clotting factor. And so what's happening? What's the clotting factor? There's 200 different clotting factors. I'm not going to go over them now. It's a beautiful system of many, you can Google it, clotting factors for fun. If that's your idea of fun. 200 different factors, 212 to be exact. It all happened in order to clot the blood, but I go over the last 5 processes that you should know. After these clotting factors happen, prothrombin activator activates something known as prothrombin, and it becomes thrombin. And thrombin becomes activated to make fibrinogen turn into fibrin. And the strands you see in 13.3 and in this figure, in other words, in the clot, is fibrin strands. Fibrin strands make up a clot, and right, fibrin strands make up a clot, and that is how you clot a vessel. All right. To make a long story short, you should be aware of a few different terms. A thrombus is a bad thing. You know, if you sit for too long, or if you have a clotting disorder, or whatever risk, a clot in an unbroken vessel is a thrombus. That is not good. A hematoma is just a clot. You know, we went over hematomas in ANP1, where that's just a clot in something, you know, a broken bone. But a thrombus is a clot in an unbroken vessel. And that is bad because it's dangerous. It can break. First of all, it blocks the proper functioning of the unbroken vessel. You don't want an unbroken vessel to be clotted. A thrombus causes a heart attack and a stroke. A clot in an artery in the brain or the heart leads to heart attack and stroke, right? If it's in the heart, it's a heart attack. If it's in the brain, it's a stroke. The big danger is that it can float. A piece of it can break off and float around. So if you have a clot in your leg, for example, which you call a deep vein thrombosis, it can become an embolus, a floating thrombus. And when that lodges somewhere and blocks another thing, it's called an embolism, often in the lungs. So what are ways to fight clotting? Here's a bunch of different ways, okay? First of all, aspirin. 81 milligrams of aspirin is supposed to be associated with 50% decline in heart attacks. That is what we believe. So should everyone over 50, you know, take a baby aspirin? There's debate about that. We'll leave it at that. But it does thin the blood a little. Plasmin is a natural clot buster. TPA is administered during stroke and heart attack to prevent, you know, the clot from causing damage. It's an artificial tissue plasminogen activator. That means TPA is tissue plasminogen activator. You should know that term, TPA, because you're going to see it when there's a heart attack patient or a stroke patient. The administration of that very quickly, again, within the first, I think, 2 hours of the incident, helps outcomes. All right. We say that diet affects our clotting abilities. Procoagulants, you know, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, they have a lot of vitamin K, leafy greens, and they actually make things more clotted, make the blood, we say, thicker. Anticoagulants like grapeseed oil, vitamin E, those are, they thin the blood. So interesting. I just want to show you in general, we can control the rate of clotting. One of the big ways we control is using warfarin or Coumadin, which interferes with the vitamin K part of the clotting process. The liver makes its own procoagulants and causes you to not bleed. When you have liver malfunction, one symptom is bleeding because you're not making those procoagulants. Again, the word procoagulant means wants you to clot, wants you to be prevented from bleeding. And again, like I said, liver malfunctions, you need the liver to absorb fat along with vitamin K so that you have the proper amount of vitamin K. And if you can't absorb fat because there's liver malfunction, you're not absorbing the vitamin K, and so you are bleeding more, right? Vitamin K prevents bleeding. It's a procoagulant. So that's one way a person bleeds due to liver malfunctions. Another way is hemophilia. Now, the hemophilia is a totally genetically, that means in the genes, you inherit it. It's a genetic bleeding disorder. We say that one of the clotting factors, factor 8, is the cause, you know, a problem with factor 8 is the cause of most bleeding disorders of hemophilia A. 83% of hemophilia is hemophilia A. Hemophilia B and C are more rare. You're not going to see it much. factor 9, factor 11. But for the most part, A and B are sex-linked. Sex-linked means it's on the X chromosome, which means men have it more than women. And the prolonged bleeding that happens is, again, more in men than women because you have to inherit it on the X chromosome. And it's a recessive trait, hemophilia. We say that genetic engineering, which is, really the scope of another course. Genetic engineering is when you insert a gene into a bacteria that you want the bacteria to produce. So genetically engineered factor 8 is given to hemophiliacs now, rather than all the blood transfusions, to help the person to clot their blood, improve their clotting factor. So that's been a great success of genetic engineering in the fight against death for hemophiliacs. A couple of other bleeding disorders or problems with the red blood cells. Thalassemias occur often in Greek and Italian descent populations. Often the hemoglobin is fragile. There's a globin chain of the hemoglobin that's fragile, faulty, or absent, some piece that's not right. And often there's no problem, but it can lead to a little bit of tiredness and weakness due to thalassemias. Sickle cell anemia is a very common disorder, mostly found in Black, Mediterranean, Middle Eastern areas where there's a lot of red, what we say, mosquitoes. And let me explain what sickle cell anemia is. Sickle cell anemia is when the red blood cell looks like this, a sickle. And that jams up in capillaries and causes clotting and damage to organs. Okay, that is the problem. So that's the problem with sickle cell. And obviously, there is a benefit. Many of you may have heard this. Well, first let me talk about the disorder. Sickle cell anemia is a recessive trait. It's inherited. If it's inherited with a normal trait, you don't even have it. You only get symptoms, real serious symptoms, when you have two genes, right, inherited from both parents for sickle cell anemia. And just to make a long story short, in the interest of time, when there's low oxygen conditions, that's when the condition is exacerbated. Why? Because the beta chains get sticky with low oxygen. And so you get more clotting and more tissue damage and organ damage with it. Okay. There is a benefit, and I'll be brief with this. The malaria parasite tends to attack people much less with sickle cell anemia or with the sickle cell gene in them. So a person who has just a gene for sickle cell anemia does not get the disorder, but does get the immunity from malaria for the most part. And that is why it is persistent in the populations in areas where malaria is common. And, guess how many people die of malaria every year? I just looked it up. Year 2019, okay? You had like 687,000 people die. I always use the number a million. And 10 million, no, 100 million got malaria and got sick. So almost a million, I'm going to round up, a million die each year. And you don't hear about it. It's nothing. The coronavirus is the big discussion, and I know, it's scary and all that, but the chances are so low in comparison to so many other disorders, afflictions like the flu, and honestly, malaria, whoa, 687,000 people died of malaria. And you don't hear about it, puff. That's the thing with the media, And all right, are there treatments? There are treatments. Sulfur treatments, and that's that's where hydroxychloroquine, that drug, comes in, where it's become very a hot political topic, and the results are all over the place. Does it work? One study says Trump was right, it works. A bunch of studies say Trump was wrong, it didn't work. And I hate that there's politics and not a lot of science out there. I would be interested, and I just can't even find it, why the drug had some effect. Somehow, COVID-19 goes into red blood cells, I think. Again, I don't even know, because the science is terrible out there, and in a way that the malaria parasite goes into the red blood cells. So it's very interesting. But again, it's very hard to find the information. I'm sure it's there. Malaria is a fascinating area. And you know what it is? It's politics. It happens in Africa, so people don't care. You know, you could argue that that's a political thing too. It's a huge rate of death from it. So, I mean, you know, I don't want to be political in an A&P class, but, you know, science is often abused and misused. That's what I'm saying. And I'm on neither side. It's just that's how it is with us science people. We are just, oof, the information is just used in different ways. But that's interesting. And then, you know, I was reading a study about you know, does COVID-19 attack people with type A blood more than any other type? And the answer is yes. So there is something to the red blood cell and the coronavirus linkage. And I don't know, you know, I've kind of researched it, but the information's terrible out there to find out. So that's a topic for you to, you know, look into for fun. But definitely type A blood is more, which of course I have, right? Type A blood, it's very common, is more susceptible to getting the COVID-19, you know, than type O blood. So that's why I said to my wife, you go in the store and shop. She's type O. Anyway, you know, these are all generalities. All right, moving on. I'm trying to make the blood interesting, but let's finish up with blood types and diagnostic blood so we make our 10 o'clock deadline. And then we can open up for questions and talk. Let's talk anemias. Okay, and I alluded to these just shortly ago. Anemia means a lacking of blood. Whatever that, you know, that's the word. If you're anemic, that means you somehow you're not having enough blood carrying the oxygen. All right, that's what it looks like. And I can always tell someone's fingers. Like if your finger looks like this, I'm pushing down on it. You have anemia. And if it looks like this, see, I pull it off, you don't. Like if it looks light in color like this, you see, look at your fingers. Look at your fingers. I should look at everyone's fingers. And if it looks like that without me pushing on it, then you have anemia. Now, obviously, I do not because it's very red. So that is not an issue. Hemorrhagic anemia is obviously a common sense one. If you lose a lot of blood, you know, you're in a car accident, you've hemorrhaged, so blood is lost. So that's hemorrhagic. Hemolytic means either you mismatched your blood, you got the wrong type of blood, or a parasite attacked you like malaria, and the red blood cell literally ruptures. That's hemolytic. The word hemolytic means to break blood in half. Aplastic means somehow the red marrow is inhibited. That means either chemotherapy, radiation, some sort of problem, usually chemo. That's what happens in your cancer patients, aplastic anemia. And so you get anemic because of the radiation. So those are three types of anemia. There's pernicious anemia, the fourth type. All right. Pernicious means you don't have enough vitamin B12. That's an easy test, vitamin B12. And iron deficiency anemia, that's the most common, everyone. If you have anemia, I would bet you just don't have enough iron. Often it's much more weighted in women than men. Part of it's due to menstruation. Part of it's due to just the amount of blood women have and how it's processed. But in this case, the red blood cell level is normal. It's just the hemoglobin is a smaller amount. And as you know from the lab this week, hemoglobinometer measures hemoglobin levels. Hematocrit measures your red blood cell levels. And both together look at anemia. So 5 types of anemia. You should know the differences. I'm going to ask you one. You know, pernicious anemia, vitamin B12, iron deficiency, not enough iron. You better get that one right. Diet related. How about that? That's better. Eat a lot of leafy greens for iron deficiency anemia. Eat meat, leafy greens, liver, certain things. You got to look up. And then last but not least, in lab, you went over the ABO blood groups. I had a little demo on that. There'll be one question on the test about it. I mean, on the practical. I just want to say we have 4 types of blood, right? A, B, AB, and O. All right, those are the 4 types of blood. You got to be one of them. And it's based on the presence or absence of these proteins known as A or B. Agglutinogens, that's a big word for surface protein. And I have a little picture here. Here's the little triangle is an A protein, okay? An A agglutinogen. If you have it, then you're A blood, right? If you have the B one, you're B blood. And look at your little red blood cell. If you have A and B, you have both. and you have nothing, if you have a clean red blood cell and you have nothing on it, then you're type O. Now, if you have nothing on it, there's nothing to attack, right? That is why you're the universal donor if you're type O. Take a look at the O. There's nothing on it. If you're A blood, you make antibodies to something that's foreign, which is B blood. If you are B blood, you make antibodies to A, right? If you're AB blood, you don't make any antibodies. You're not going to attack anything because everything looks like your own blood. So AB is the universal recipient. It can receive any blood. O is the universal donor. It cannot get blood from anyone except O because it makes antibodies to everything. Okay, that is the rationale behind it. And whenever you see positive or negative, that means it's the Rh factor. The Rh factor is the antigen, another type of antigen or agglutinogen on a red blood cell. 85% of us have it, so we're called Rh positive. So I'm A positive blood, that means I'm A, and I have another thing, the Rh factor on me. 15% of us are negative, and my wife is O negative. That means she doesn't have any A or B on it, and she doesn't have the Rh factor. So the positive or negative refers to the Rh factor only. And that becomes important with babies when babies are born, not the first pregnancy or the second. Don't laugh. Here's my picture of a babe coming out and a mom. If the babe is Rh positive upon the second birth, what happens is during the first birth, let me just say this. If you're Rh negative, you are not interested, or rather, you don't want positive Rhs in you. So when the placenta ruptures, you get a little in you as a mom of the little babe's Rh positive, and you start making antibodies to Rh. So during the second pregnancy, the Rh positive antibodies can attack and destroy the babe. All right, that's important. That's important. And so they treat you with RhoGAM shots in order to do to remove. And I actually looked up the biochemistry of it to remove the Rh positive antibodies. And we've got some requests. Let me just see. This is all in chapter 13, okay? All this is chapter 13. Let me repeat who gives to who, okay? With the blood types. Who can receive to who? That's an important. Let's do a little quiz. All right? Let's do a little quiz. Let me go back to and then I'm going to go over the diagnostic tests, all right? I know we're a little over time, but let's just do this. A can give to A, right? And B can give to B, and AB can give to AB, and O can give to O. Okay, we know that. O can give to everybody else because it doesn't have anything on it that is unappealing. AB can get from everyone but can't give to anybody. AB is selfish. Just think about AB. If you hear someone has AB blood, tell them you're selfish. You just take. O is the giver. My wife's a giver. She's kind of giving, and she gives her blood. She does actually donate blood. A cannot donate to B. A cannot donate to O, but A can donate to AB. So everyone can donate to AB, and nobody can donate to O, but everyone can take away from O. So maybe you want to write next to AB, universal recipient. Universal recipient. And next to O, write universal donor. In other words, it can give to everyone. And all of this is starting on page 469 and ending, I would say, on page 476. So we'll start 476 after the test. This concludes the material for the test. Let me just go over very briefly in the interest of time. We're at 10:02. It'll just take me about 2 minutes, and then we'll be close to time. I just want to show you a complete blood count was what we're talking about. Every year you should get a complete blood count, which takes all your formed elements, white blood cells, red blood cells, platelets, goes through all your clotting factors. It gives you your whole blood chemistry profile, your SMAC, okay? Gives you your pro time, your rate of clotting, your prothrombin time, how quickly you clot. It gives you a differential, which is the percentage of white blood cells in your blood. And all of this you kind of we had in your lab this week, but these are the diagnostic tests. A complete blood count covers all of it, and it includes a blood chemistry profile, it includes a differential cell count, and it can include your clotting factors, how quickly you clot. And the faster you clot, the thicker the blood, we say. The slower you clot, the more you bleed. And that's given by what we call your pro time. Let me open up, I've been trying to be sure, allow you to unmute yourself. And I want to be sure to try to keep all the lectures to 1 hour, just in the interest of time. So we're at 10:03, so we're pretty close. Now I'd like to open it up to questions. Happy to do so. This is a lot of material. Ladies and gentlemen, this material I would take between yesterday's lecture and today. I told my wife I would take a month in class. Babbling around, you take attendance, you chit chat, you do quizzes. There's pros and cons to this type of method. You got to stick with it. Now we're done. You got a month's worth of work done in 2 days. But that means, read over the material, study, ask me questions, and feel free. It may come naturally and it's easy. I would rather take it this way if I were a student and get it over with instead of spending a whole month. But it is a little bit of a challenge. So go right ahead, ask any questions and whatever you want, and you can feel free to email me as well. But those are the pages. What else? Anything unclear? Anything you want to ask from the last test? And exam is on endocrinology and blood. That is it. Exam 1. Exam 40 questions. Tuesday, 9 a.m. I'm going to email it to you just like usual. And I think you'll do okay. I don't see a problem. I would have my notes open and my book open, and I would go through and see. Don't trust the internet. You look up stuff, forget it. You don't know what the heck. And if you go through the stuff and you learn the material, it'll come smoothly to you. I had some students fail the practical last semester, online A&P, fail a couple of tests, and really the best route is to come to these classes. Ask questions if ask questions, but mostly highlight the book, or have the book open, highlight your notes, have the book open as what do you call it? As a backup. That's what I would do. And I would certainly read the book once, just so it's all there. And I will put this on the YouTube channel. I don't know, listening to it over, I don't know how much fun that is, but however best that you learn, and I would try to put everything on a concept map that you learned, honestly, so you can go back to it. When I used to do job interviews, I would put all my credentials, everything on a concept map, so I could look at what I'm going to say, in the job interview. And that's the same for like a take-home test. Just put it all on one piece of paper, all the terms you need to know, so it's right there. And I think that's a good method, and you'll have it in your head to just answer it quick. 40 questions, 55 minutes. Remember, that was our deal. You always get 15 minutes more than the questions. I think that it worked pretty well, and that'll be fine. We have a total of 4 tests and 1 practical, and I dropped the lowest. So out of 5, 1 gets dropped. So try to lower the anxiety with all this stuff. What other goodies? Are you guys comfortable? Honestly, I would be uncomfortable. If I were a student, I would be nervous, like there's a ton of stuff we went over. So I would go over it. Look, if you understood it all, then there's really not a problem. This is kind of hard to understand. If I were a student, I'd say, what is he talking about? Intrinsic, extrinsic. And I'm just saying the way in which you get to the clotting factors, that if it's the inside of a vessel that breaks, that's intrinsic. If it's outside the vessel, a cell, I don't know, whatever, a kidney cell, a liver cell, then it's extrinsic because it sends out a tissue factor for the dying cell. What else would I get worked up about as a student? Because I remember being a student, it was a long time ago. It seems like yesterday. I wouldn't be too nervous about these. These are the characteristics of each white blood cell. I might ask you which one's involved with parasites, and you've got to remember, hey, eosinophil. Which one's involved as the first line of defense, as a bacteria slayer. And then, here it is. But you got to be familiar with where stuff is. That's why I would say highlight. And which is the most numerous. Here it is. Never let monkeys eat bananas. Basophil, neutrophil, most numerous. Which is the least numerous? Basophil. And you can pretty much figure out what Demphley will ask you on the test. Which one doesn't have any nucleus? Is not a true cell, you know. Red blood cell, erythrocyte. And you have to be familiar that erythrocyte is a red blood cell. So if you're working in, you know, if you're working in a lab and you see the word erythrocyte, you don't not know what it is. You got to know leukocyte is white blood cell. That's what you're going to see. The doctor will call it white blood cell, but it will be written as leukocyte. And you know, you're learning language, so I wouldn't be too nervous about it. But I would read it and have a little fun with it. If you want anything explained, happy to do so. And that's what I would do. So we'll have the test Tuesday. We're not meeting, obviously, until Tuesday. And then, oh, wow. Delhi is going to open up in the fall. Tanya, is this true? Whoa. I can't believe it. That would be good. Online is, you know, it's good you guys did this in the summer. Well, we're going to have our pizza party then. Summer of 2020. That would be fantastic. I got to check my email. So I'm kind of excited. But it's good you get A&P out of the way, guys. Believe me, you will have a nicer life when you get back, getting this out of the way. So I'm glad you're here. That's good news. I got to check my email. This is very intriguing. All right. Anyway, other questions? Anything else? Tanya, is liberal arts and science opening, or are we online? Because I know nursing was planning to open. For all students, this is unbelievable. I love it. Well, you know, the death rate, didn't I tell you this from the beginning? The death rate, if you're under 60, is less than the flu, which I am under 60. Do not say I'm over 60, because I'm not. But anyway, for my age, it's worse than for your age. I think one person died in all of New Jersey under the age of 18. So how can you keep 18-year-olds? See, that's the tragedy, keeping all the young home. One day, let me tell you, this is going to be seen as a disaster because it's ridiculous. But anyway, August 31st. Tanya, that is great news. Well, let's celebrate. I got to see it from my own eyes, though. You know, they've been so crazy about it. So this is really interesting. And we have a new provost. I don't know who it is. I know that there's 3 candidates. And Dean will be going back to being the nursing dean. We have a new chancellor of schools who's totally online. So I was really suspicious politically that we're going to stay online, you know. There's a lot of crazy stuff. So this is really good news. I would like to be back. Online is fun, right? But it's not the same. You got to have human beings. But anyway, good. All right. Well, congratulations. That sounds good. All right, listen, if you have questions, email me over the weekend, anything, but you got to be there Tuesday at 9 a.m., all right? And we do have a few people missing, so we'll go from there. All right, I better shut the record button.